You hear the snapping of a twig and a hiss. You instinctively turn, your greatest and final mistake, and you are greeted by a pair of glowing eyes with slit pupils peering back at you from the darkness. Suddenly, your body begins to seize up, starting from your toes and your fingers. You try to run, but your legs quickly become frozen, and you realize it's too late. The last thing to turn to stone is your head, allowing you to savor your final moments as your vision goes dark and the curse reaches your brain. Hello, I'm Conan of Coco's Homebrew, and welcome to the second episode of From Mythos to Monsters, where we look at how different mythological beasts have been reinterpreted in the modern fantasy genre. Again, if you like this podcast and you want to support me in making it, please check out my Patreon. Over there I make homebrew content for D&D, and maybe in future even some exclusive podcast content. Now, let's talk about today's monster, or rather monsters. Yes, if you've read the title, you might be wondering why this episode is about two different creatures instead of one. Well, that's because the Basilisk and Cockatrice are arguably one and the same, both stemming from the same legends that became reinterpreted over time and as a result split them in two. We begin our journey with Pliny the Elder, all the way back in 79 AD, back in the days when people were bestowed cool titles like the Elder just because they survived past the age of 30. Pliny was a Roman author who wrote a book of natural history that contained the first ever mention of the basilisk. In Pliny's book, he describes the basiliscus as a creature which could turn its victims to stone and breathe toxic gas that could cause widespread destruction, killing animals and plants across the land. Later, Isidore of Seville referred to the creature as being the King of Serpents, a title that the monster is often attributed ever since. Now, obviously there has never been a real animal capable of doing these things. Pliny's natural history was supposed to be science, not fiction, so where did he get the idea that such a bizarre beast exists? Well, it appears to be related to animals in Egypt, probably either a far-fetched description of a cobra or the Nile crocodile. However, this is where things get interesting. If descriptions of the basiliscus were inspired by the crocodile, they might have also been influenced by mentions of the trochilus bird, which is known to enter the mouths of crocodiles to clean their teeth. So, we have our first mention of a bird in relation to the legend of the basilisk, but not the last. In the book De Naturis Rerum, the basilisk was described as being created from the egg of a rooster that was then incubated by either a snake or a toad. Do you see where this is going? Well, things really took a turn when De Proprietabus Rerum, sorry for butchering that, was eventually translated into English, finally giving us a translation for the word basiliscus in the 14th century. You might be expecting that this is where we get the word basilisk from, but you're wrong. The book translated the word basiliscus as Cockatrice. Wow, what a plot twist. So begins the legend of the Cockatrice. However, that doesn't mean the basilisk subsided. It continued to be mentioned throughout history. Tales like Shakespeare's Cymbeline, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and even in the Bible. While the basilisk continued to exist in legend, however, it now had to compete with the new cock of the walk. Half rooster, half snake, the cockatrice had emerged and it was here to stay. Rising to popularity during the late Middle Ages, this curious creature captured imaginations of people across Europe, particularly in England. For instance, the noble Langley family of Lancashire, England, have used the cockatrice as a heraldic symbol since the 14th century, while Shakespeare has made multiple references to the creature in his plays, specifically in Romeo and Juliet and Richard III. Also in England, the village of Werwell in Hampshire is still associated with the cockatrice to this day. There's a story that the village was terrorised by one until it was imprisoned in a dungeon. While it had been captured, however, the villagers were unable to fully kill the beast without succumbing to its glare. That was until the arrival of a hero whose name would echo throughout history. Green. Yes, as in the colour green. Anyway, our hero Green had a brilliant idea. He grabbed a mirror, took it down to the dungeon, and forced the cockatrice to stare at its own reflection until it was weak enough for him to slay. This mighty warrior was able to kill the starving caged creature, yet for some reason we don't celebrate his achievements. Why do so many saints get their own days but not Green? Maybe it's to avoid confusion with the band, I don't know. Anyway, the cockatrice remained a popular folk legend into the 17th century, continuing to be developed with new details such as the idea that the monster's natural nemesis was the weasel, who was immune to its petrifying stare and whose urine could kill it instantly. To be fair, I'm not a fan of weasel piss either, but I'd still rather take that than a face full of the Tarrasque's burning shit. It was also said that the cockatrice could be easily scared away by the crowing of a rooster, although perhaps it was just trying to avoid a distant relative. All of that takes us up to the modern day, where the cockatrice and the basilisk continue to have a popular, albeit separate presence in the fantasy genre. To further individualise both creatures, depictions of the basilisk have skewed more towards that of a serpent or a reptile, notably popularised by games like D&D and books like Harry Potter and A Song of Ice and Fire. Now, as popular as Harry Potter has become, J.K. Rowling sucks, and her description of the basilisk sucks as well. She describes the creature as an enormous serpent, bright poisonous green, thick as an oak trunk, which in my opinion is an underwhelming and uninspired take on the legend. I much prefer its depiction in Dungeons & Dragons, which, since its first edition in 1974, has shown the basilisk as being a hulking beast with many legs, comparable to a reptilian centipede. This has allowed it to remain identifiable among the game's many other dragon-like creatures, while also being faithful to historical artwork. The cockatrice also made its debut in D&D's first edition, and there are several interesting things to note about its interpretation. Firstly, it not only has a rooster's body and a serpent's tail, it also has the wings of a bat. Now, for the life of me, I couldn't find any other interpretation of the cockatrice in history that has bat features, so this seems to be another quirk thought up by the creator of D&D, Gary Gygax. I did warn you in the last podcast that you're going to quickly get used to Gary popping up and making completely incomprehensible decisions like this. Additionally, unlike its namesake legend, the cockatrice of D&D must also peck people with its beak before it can turn them to stone, which is a pretty serious downgrade compared to its abilities in the legend. At the very least, the 2025 Monster Manual gives it a normal variant as well as a more fearsome Regent variant, which does the beast a bit more justice and makes the idea that it could terrorise any village a bit more believable. Meanwhile, D&D's Basilisk has, unlike the cockatrice, managed to make it through all editions of the game, holding on to its petrifying stare. It's still not a wholly accurate depiction though. While it does have a poisonous bite, this isn't quite akin to the poisonous breath it was described as having in legend, which was so potent that it could devastate large areas and even repel the weapons of foes when it was attacked. So, how can we as storytellers give these creatures the grandeur they deserve while still keeping them wholly identifiable from one another? Well, I have some ideas about what I would do. It's difficult to reinterpret the cockatrice since, unlike the basilisk, it sort of came out of thin air. There aren't really many legends about it or pre-17th century descriptions of it. I do think the idea that the common weasel being its arch rival is underutilised and pretty funny. I really like the idea of a bunch of adventurers or monster slayers who are tasked with killing a cockatrice, prepping for their hunt by figuring out how to catch a weasel and bottle its piss. I'm more interested, however, in helping the basilisk regain some of its former grandeur, and having it seem like much more of an imposing beast from folklore that could terrorise entire countries instead of just villages. To achieve this, I would go to great lengths to make the basilisk as imposing as possible. Firstly, I would adorn its head with a crown-like protrusion, similar to what it had in many previous depictions, but which games like The Witcher and D&D have neglected to bestow it in their own interpretations. Next, I would make sure the basilisk was as powerful as it was once feared to be, while also being careful to hone in on the parts of its legend that make it distinct from other monstrous reptiles, like dragons for example. I would write of how the basilisk's poisonous breath had eradicated all life around its lair for miles, turning its domain into a barren, lifeless wasteland. The closer you got to its nest, the more your path would become obstructed by the battalions of petrified stone corpses of those who had tried to defeat it before you. After all, it wouldn't be the king of lizards without a kingdom of helpless subjects to rule over. Just make sure you see it before it sees you. Alright, I think that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed learning about these two monsters. I personally think that they're pretty underrated in the landscape of fantasy and deserve a bit more love. If you've got any thoughts about them you'd like to share, or maybe ideas for some monsters you'd like to see feature in future podcasts, please let me know in the YouTube or Spotify comments, or through my Patreon or my Discord. I still don't have a cool outro or anything, so I guess I'm just going to say thank you and goodbye.